Good morning, everyone. My name is Linda Butcher. I'm the Director of Media Relations and Public Affairs here at KEI. Before continuing, I want to express our gratitude to the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea for partnering with us on this wonderful program that has provided us insight and analysis on the creation and impact of the Act on what is expected in the years to come. I would like to specifically thank Greg Scarlett, Rosa Park, and Daniel Hong, as well as my colleagues Troy Stangerone, Claire Hubbard, Sang Kim, and Min Kong for their invaluable work to bringing this program to life, and for the leadership by President Donald Manzullo and Mark Tokola, KI's News Vice President, who is in the back of the room. The first panel did an excellent job on laying out the foundation of the Act by providing us a unique behind-the-scenes look and the personal experiences by those affected by the Act. Not only does 2014 mark the 10th anniversary of the North Korea Human Rights Act, but it also has become a significant year for discussion on human rights in North Korea, not only by the U.S. and South Korea, but also by the international community. Our second panel will focus on what is to come in the next decades and beyond. These three experts really do not need an introduction, but also will provide it. A leading expert on internally displaced persons, Roberta Cohen, will discuss protection of North Korean refugees. She's a non-resident senior fellow in foreign policy studies of the Brookings Institution, where she specializes in human rights and humanitarian issues. She co-founded and co-directed the Brookings Project on Internal Displacement and served as senior advisor to the representative of the UN Secretary General on Internally Displaced Persons from 1994 to 2010. Earlier, during the Carter administration, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. She has written extensively on human rights in North Korea, with her most recent article with 38 North, where she laid out 5 key caveats when pursuing human rights dialogue with North Korea. Our second speaker is Nathaniel Kretchen, who present on bringing down North Korea's information firewall. He is currently the Associate Director at Intermedia, where he oversees projects that focus on Asian hard-to-access population. Considered as the guy on media and technology trends in North Korea, Nat co-authored the 2012 report, A Quiet Opening, North Koreans in a Changing Media Environment, which was a great groundbreaking study conducted on behalf of the Department of State that is based on research among North Korean defectors, refugees, and travels abroad. If you haven't read those 2 articles, you definitely should. And finally, our final speaker is Greg Scarlett, Executive Director for Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. Greg will provide a forward-looking on what we should expect in the next decade. Some fun facts about Greg is that prior to working at HRNK, he was actually the Director of Public Affairs and Business Issues here at KEI. He also has 18 years of Korean and English language broadcasting experience for TV and radio stations, including Radio Free Asia, KBS, Hyundai Broadcasting System, and Arirang TV. In addition, for 11 years, he has been authoring and broadcasting the weekly Scarlett 2 column to North Korea for Radio Free Asia. And with that, I will have Roberta Cohen present her presentation. Thank you.
Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of really a celebration of the North Korea Human Rights Act, and we're particularly grateful to Dan Manzullo and the Korea Economic Institute for hosting this together with HRNK. My remarks follow very closely from the previous panel having to do with the refugee issue. So I wanted to begin with something Bob King pointed out, Ambassador King, that it's much harder to get out of North Korea now than it was in the past, and that in 2013, only 1,500 North Koreans managed to get out of their country and reach South Korea. That's about half the number who came the year before, and it's been going down since 2009, when the total was some 2,900, nearly 3,000. The major reason is that North Korea has been cracking down at the border, and China, for its part, has been collaborating with North Koreans and forcibly repatriating North Koreans who face brutal treatment on return. According to the United Nations, China has forced back tens of thousands of North Koreans over the past 2 decades. It considers these people to be economic migrants. When the North Korea Human Rights Act was adopted in 2004, as we've heard, and followed by the Reauthorization Acts, Congress recognized the desperate situation at the border, and it called on the U.S. to promote the protection of North Korean refugees by encouraging Asian countries, including China, to provide safe haven to the refugees, and by supporting the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, in taking steps to gain access for North Koreans to China. Congress also called upon the U.S. to facilitate the entry into this country of acutely vulnerable North Koreans, while recognizing that South Korea has the principal responsibility for North Koreans' resettlement. It called for a credible number to come in as refugees. Now, since the passage of the act, the U.S. government has given greater attention to the North Korean refugee problem. You can see that in public statements. You can see that in U.S. positions at the UN. You can see that in the U.S.'s bilateral relationships with China and other countries. And the U.S. has also given assistance to groups helping North Korean refugees. And we also benefit greatly from having Robert King as the special envoy for human rights in North Korea. But let me say that there is a way to go when it comes to the admission of North Korean refugees to the United States. And more priority is needed in addressing the forcible repatriation of North Koreans from China. Concerning the admission of North Korean refugees, what are the barriers? Only some 174 were admitted over the past 10 years, although that's more than before. And out of 70,000 refugees who came here from all countries all over the world in fiscal year 2013, the total number of North Koreans was 17. Now, it's been pointed out that North Korea and North Koreans, of course, share a common ethnicity, language, culture with South Koreans. And so that is their preferred country of choice. The South also gives Northerners generous benefits upon arrival. And over the past 15 years, I believe more than 27,000 North Koreans have gone to South Korea. But it should also be borne in mind that America is home to the largest Korean population outside of Northeast Asia, some 2 million Korean Americans. And significant numbers have family ties to North Korea. Listening to Jin-Hae Jo, it's hard to imagine that only 17 would have liked to come to this country in fiscal year 2013. Why would they have? Because of America's varied economic and educational opportunities, because of discrimination reported in the South against Northerners, because some fear that in South Korea information about them could more easily reach the North and harm their families, friends, and professional associates. The Reauthorization Act of 2008 thus called on the U.S. government to explore new opportunities with South Korea for resettling North Koreans who express a wish to resettle in the U.S. but who have not yet become South Korean citizens. And that brings us to the legal barrier, which was alluded to in the first panel. North Koreans, as you know, have the right to citizenship under South Korea's constitution, so they can enjoy the protection of the Republic of Korea. Are they therefore still eligible for U.S. refugee status? For many years, the U.S. government did not think so. But what the North Korea Human Rights Act did was to draw a distinction between having a legal right to citizenship and availing oneself of that right. In other words, North Koreans who didn't avail themselves of the right to be South Korean citizens could be admitted to the United States as refugees. But the window of opportunity for becoming a refugee in the U.S. is narrow. North Koreans, upon arrival in the South, almost automatically become South Korean citizens, in some cases even before they arrive. And a 2011 ruling by the Board of Immigration Appeals of the Justice Department argued to narrow the space even further. It said that the mere availability of permanent resident status elsewhere, the mere availability, may be sufficient to prove that the person is ineligible for refugee or asylum status in the U.S. In face of these legal complexities, it's to be hoped that U.S. officials would take the special circumstances of North Koreans into account. Unlike other people seeking refugee or asylum status, North Koreans have long been isolated from and uninformed about the outside world. They may not know they can go to the United States, or know they might even want to go there. After all, they've been indoctrinated all their lives against the United States. In order to make an informed choice about their future, they need information about America, about their opportunity to go there and the benefits offered. North Koreans could be better informed by U.S. embassies in Southeast Asia about the possibility of resettling in the U.S., and they could more regularly receive English language and computer and vocational training while they wait. It can take from 6 months to a year, and in a small number of cases, even 2 years, for the U.S. to process their claims. In fact, a good number of North Koreans in Southeast Asia who do apply to go to the U.S. withdraw their applications and go on to South Korea because of the length of time it takes. Now, to its credit, the U.S. has added staff and added resources to process cases and expedite security checks, and Ambassador King has pointed out that the time is shorter for other people and that many efforts are undertaken. Problems also arise from Southeast Asian governments, which do not always provide exit visas quickly. Some don't want to damage their relations with Pyongyang or become a magnet for refugees. Just recall Laos's forcing back of a group of North Korean youth in 2013 in collusion with China. And China, for its part, has refused to allow U.S. consular officials or UNHCR access to North Koreans in the border areas where they arrive. So where do we go from here? It's true that refugee problems in other parts of the world, especially in the Middle East, and migrants at the U.S. border, have been overwhelming the U.S. But an effort should be made to increase the number of North Koreans coming to this country to, I think, a more credible number. And if North Koreans have a compelling reason to resettle in the United States, the U.S. could explore more flexible approaches. I do remember that when Soviet Jews exited the USSR in the late 70s and 80s, had a country of protection, Israel, which offered them automatic citizenship. But the U.S. and refugee organizations made sure they had a choice to resettle not only in Israel, but in the United States and other countries, and they received a lot of information about their options. Even after they resettled in Israel, some were able to come to this country. Knowledgeable lawyers could identify what can be done. Let's turn now to the protection of North Korean refugees from forced repatriations. In implementation of the North Korea Human Rights Act, the United States has spoken out on different occasions against China's forced repatriations, and it has also raised the issue in U.S.-China human rights dialogues. President Obama himself reportedly raised the subject with China's president. At the UN, the U.S. strongly endorsed the widely publicized Commission of Inquiry report, which singles out China for possibly aiding and abetting North Korea in committing crimes against humanity by forcibly repatriating North Koreans who are punished harshly when they are returned. Missing, however, is an overall international strategy for dealing with the refugee issue, a strategy that treats the issue as a multilateral one, involving not just China and North Korea, but South Korea and neighboring countries like Japan, Russia, Southeast Asia, Mongolia, and also Western countries that take in North Koreans. or who might have North Korean workers that might at some point defect. Such a strategy should involve the UN Secretary General and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to mobilize backup for UNHCR's request for access to the border and for a special humanitarian protection status for North Korean refugees. The goal of the plan would be a moratorium on deportations and multilateral arrangements for taking in North Koreans. Are there any steps to build on? Just a few, but worth noting. UNHCR seems to have become more vocal in pointing out that North Koreans are not economic migrants, but in fact refugees sur place. They may not have been refugees when they left the country, but they become so because of the persecution they face on return. I think UNHCR has also come to see that China's position toward North Koreans affects the attitudes of other Asian countries toward North Korean refugees. Look at Laos, and toward international refugee law. It's very undermining. In addition, China has been strengthening its relations with South Korea, which has been raising the issue with China. This year, China allowed a few...
Accessibility settings.
Okay, I thought it was a fire drill. That's happened to me. This year, China allowed a few North Koreans for whom President Park interceded to go forward to South Korea. It was not the first time, but it's still something to try to build on. In addressing the UN General Assembly in September, President Park, in a message apparently directed to China, asserted that North Korean defectors should be able to choose the countries in which they want to settle. Since China repeatedly has said that constructive dialogue is the way to address differences in human rights, why not take China at its word and promote dialogues and a multilateral approach to the refugee issue? In 2012, China adopted a new law, which for the first time has a provision on refugees, and it has been cooperating with UNHCR on other refugee populations. Any multilateral plan, of course, would need to balance China's concerns about stability on its border with the need to lend support to North Koreans who should have the right to leave their country and request asylum elsewhere, and who have been risking their lives to escape from a country whose human rights record has been described as without parallel in the contemporary world. Giving greater priority to this issue on the part of the United States would certainly reflect the intent of the North Korea Human Rights Act. Thank you very much.
We'll have Nat Crutchen, who will present on bringing down North Korea's information firewall.
Cool. You want me to stand over there, or?
Sure.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Well, thanks everyone so much for having me. Really appreciate the invitation from KEI and HRNK. Really an honor to be here to celebrate and mark the occasion. And being amongst such distinguished panelists, I need to hide behind some numbers and slides, so I had to clear everybody off. I've basically been asked to talk a little bit today about the information and media environment inside of North Korea. As has been mentioned a couple times in the previous panel, one of the aims of the North Korean Human Rights Act was to increase the availability of outside information into North Korea. And so for the past, it's been over 10 years now that Intermedia has been doing work looking into this issue, essentially. And most of my presentation today will kind of lay out more or less what we know about the information environment in North Korea currently. but it'll focus a lot on what we've seen change. So I think it's probably important up top to just establish the baseline that North Korea remains the most repressive media regime in the world. Freedom House ranks it at the very bottom of their media freedom index every year. Very strict controls on outside information and sharing of information amongst people. And so I'll highlight some of the ways that this has changed, but it's probably important to keep in mind that we're starting from an extremely low base. The way that we kind of get at these answers is through trying to research North Korea primarily with refugees and defectors. And North Korea is about as challenging a research environment as you'll find. We don't have direct access to the country, so despite the fact that I work for a survey research firm who does very methodologically robust things, when it comes to North Korea, we have to kind of take what we can get and do our best to understand the truth given the limitations. And so it's important to kind of keep findings, especially specific percentages, in mind, the context in mind. But all that said, I think it is really important to kind of look at what we can learn. And the fact that we've been monitoring it for as long as we have, I think really does paint a picture that things have changed a lot. This is no longer Kim Il-sung's North Korea in terms of the information environment. There we go. These are the caveats that I kind of have to make sure to present before we put any numbers up on the screen. And so samples are non-representative. We can't do these things inside of North Korea. Most of our studies overrepresent the border areas a little bit. There's always going to be an X factor when we talk about refugees, people who've essentially voted with their feet and left. We think that actually recent trends in refugee and defector flows that have been spoken about previously probably mean that the folks that we talk to these days are better proxies for your average North Korean, in as much as they're not spending a long time in China. They're often brought out through family members' chain defections, and so are probably a little closer to your average North Korean. And, as has also been mentioned, these people in China face the threat of repatriation. They're in China illegally. These interviews are conducted under relatively difficult circumstances. When we think about the media environment in general, as Doug mentioned in his remarks, the famine was really the turning point. Prior to that, information controls were really effectively maintained. Since then, however, as people have had to rely on markets in order to basically, keep themselves alive, there's been much more cross-border traffic with China. There's less reliance and trust in the state, and people have been sharing a lot more information, mostly out of sheer necessity to be able to to conduct the business that allows them to make a living and stay alive. And we see, especially in the qualitative work that we do, that this really has, a real psychological impact on the folks who are exposed to outside media, especially those who, up to that point, had, only been exposed to what the regime had presented them with. And so statements like this are not uncommon when we do these interviews. And so in the next slide, we'll present a couple of numbers, and these come from a Broadcasting Board of Governors survey that was conducted in 2010, and it's part of the Quiet Opening report that Linda mentioned. And I mean, as you see, people have access to a pretty wide array of different media devices. This doesn't look like what most folks would expect North Korea to look like if they, hadn't examined the issue in more depth. And we've only seen these numbers grow in more recent years. As you can see, TV is nearly ubiquitous, and radio, which is a really important source of outside information, still you're looking at nearly half the population amongst those we survey. DVDs have become extremely popular, mostly on the backs of these incredibly compelling South Korean dramas, which now circulate in North Korea very frequently. And we start to see the emergence of more advanced media devices. Now we're picking up USBs, special DVD players that have functionalities that are important to North Koreans. And, in more recent years, mobile phones are really making a difference. Not just illegal mobile phones along the border, but also the sanctioned mobile phones are just kind of contributing to a culture of people who know how to deal with technology and are starting to push the bounds of what's allowed. In terms of foreign media reach, you'll see, foreign radio over 20% in this particular survey, and that's something that remains relatively steady year on year over the time that we've been doing these. And radio, despite kind of seeming like a bygone technology, is extremely important in the North Korean context because it's the only real-time source of sensitive information available inside the country, throughout the country. Foreign TV is available from China along the Chinese border, and to some folks along the South Korean border, they can pick up KBS or MBC if they have the right kind of tuners on their TV. But foreign radio is it if you're talking about serving the entire population of North Korea with news from the outside. And as Ambassador King mentioned, when we look at the stations that North Koreans are listening to, it's U.S.-funded foreign broadcasts and KBS. There are some Chinese broadcasters that are also listened to, but by and large, it's the U.S. and South Korea where people are turning to for their outside information. You'll see above and away foreign DVDs are the most widely accessed. And it's not surprising. The way that these surveys are conducted, you don't expect to see this level of kind of linear growth. And yet, the trends have been so powerful that we do. Year on year, this continues to grow. Foreign DVDs, they're in the Korean language. They're very well produced. They're popular all over Asia. It makes perfect sense that they're popular in North Korea, where there's already a latent interest in all things South Korean. And I think above and beyond that, another reason why they really resonate with North Koreans is because they're so clearly not propaganda. The North Koreans, despite having, taken in propaganda all their lives, are able to spot when something is being targeted at them with a political message. And these are clearly, for South Koreans, by South Koreans, and entertainment. And despite that, the things that they pick up along the margins of just the kind of clothes they wear, the cars, the scenes of South Korea, which many assume to be, these kind of wild sets the first time they see them. After they see them repeated in enough dramas, they start to understand that, no, these are just shots of Seoul. And this is be-real footage from Seoul. And so, DVDs have been a big part of that story. The reason that this has all become possible is part and parcel with the changes that we've seen since the late 90s. As incentive structures have changed for those who are responsible for, catching people who violate laws against accessing foreign media, they've now been willing to accept bribes in many cases. And, more recent surveys, the amount of people who have paid bribes to get out of getting into trouble is quite high percentages. And so, even though we've seen renewed crackdowns as late, especially since Kim Jong-un has kind of come into power, in many cases, you can still pay a relatively small bribe and avoid a big punishment in order to access outside media. There we go. And another thing that the kind of lack of control that we used to see in kind of the Kim Il-sung era has led to the secondary effects of media access, essentially word of mouth. People, when they receive this information, go on to share it. And while it does create a much larger audience for particularly important pieces of information, I think probably the most important thing that this does is it creates horizontal social connections, which previously were very limited in North Korea. The regime's control structure was built around vertically siloing people so that they couldn't communicate with one another. And they would always be in fear that, if they said something, someone would report on them. But that has really broken down. And we see it in the numbers as well. Watching foreign DVDs is illegal. You can get in big trouble for watching foreign DVDs. And yet, well over half of folks watch them with people, family, friends, others they trust. You don't go out in the street announcing that you're doing this, but clearly there are close social bonds, within which they're not worried about the regime kind of inserting itself. And it starts to come out in really interesting ways, in more kind of insipid ways in the culture, where you see things like this, where people are able to signal to each other that, oh, I'm kind of in the know on this. I'm part of the group who is accessing outside media. And, there's an implicit value statement in that amongst folks who are saying, oh, well, I'm going to go around the controls that are in place in order to view something that I think is worth it. Nope. So that's those are kind of the highlights of what we've been seeing in general, what we've been trying to monitor, both the direct effects of the kinds of outside media that are making it into North Korea, as well as the secondary effects of word of mouth, information spreading that way. But I wanted to highlight a few kind of more recent trends that we've been looking at as well, in addition to kind of what's been in the report previously. And a couple of them that have been particularly interesting are recent crackdowns. Since Kim Jong-un has come into power, since the death of his father, things have become quite difficult in terms of data collection. Recruitment's taking much longer. Response rates are down. People are palpably more scared than they were, a few years ago when we asked questions, that would be perceived as sensitive. Yet, despite that, we've seen continued growth in access rates for outside media. The rates haven't flagged amongst our survey respondents, even as we can, feel the climate of fear on the border increase. So that's been one kind of that juxtaposition between the crackdowns and also kind of a normalization in these behaviors. But then also a generation gap, which we have been trying to delve into a little more with each subsequent study. People who were adults during the Kim Il-sung era basically knew a time when the bargain that the state made with its people more or less held. They might not like it, but, you do what you're told and you'll at least be given, enough to eat and a place to live. But young North Koreans now, they don't know a time when the system, as it's been described to them in propaganda, was actually functioning. Since they have a living memory, they've had to work around the system in order to find ways to eke out a living. And so their relationship with the state is quite different than you would have seen in previous generations. They're characterized by some interesting, almost paradoxical elements where they're kind of aspirational. They think that, oh, if I work hard, I might be able to save some money and improve my lot in life a little bit. But they're also really cynical. They have very little trust in the regime or any of the things that they're told or sold. And, we see them as kind of both escapist and very pragmatic. They watch South Korean dramas with great relish to kind of transport themselves out of their situation, and yet the thing they want to hear when we ask them, what would you like to hear on international radio, is anything that will affect market prices, anything that might be a supply shock that will affect my bottom line when I'm doing my trading. So there's some interesting dynamics there, and for as those of us who kind of work on this issue know, the most difficult thing in reaching North Koreans with outside information is delivery, dissemination. Radio remains important because radio is the only way we can get things in. It's really hard to figure out ways to get physical elements across the border in any kind of, monitorable way. But we've seen interesting trends amongst younger folks, and especially with the use of advanced media devices. DVDs are being replaced very quickly by USBs, which are much easier to hide and transport and only facilitates that kind of sharing that we saw with DVDs in the first place. And so every kind of potential advantage that these new technologies hold, North Koreans have very quickly found a way to utilize it to get around, the obstacles that they have to overcome to be able to access the content they want. And so when we kind of try to look at the overall picture, the trajectory is relatively clear. Timelines are always going to be difficult to talk about, but especially thinking about some of the generational gaps, the regime can't turn back the clock. There's no true retrenchment. We see a pretty credible effort at creating new cross-cutting groups within, the police and the military, public security, attempting to crack down specifically on foreign media, and yet people continue to access them in growing rates. Bribes might get higher, but people still find a way. And there is a place for outsiders to contribute to change's catalyst. I mean, we see with the radio programs that are produced by folks in this room that better content is going into North Korea than was the case even 5 years ago. VOA, RFA continue to improve what goes out over the airways. And these new technologies offer, hope for new ways to get in. I think it's far from being solved, but there's some potential in those that I think smart people are exploring. And even though media and outside information is related to a lot of these social and economic dynamics, it's only one of many factors that are going on the ground in North Korea that are really creating this picture of North Korean grassroots society, which is quite different from the common understanding, under Kim Il-sung or even 10 years ago. So the thing that I'll kind of, if I can get this last slide, okay. The thing that I'll kind of close on is when we ask folks about, what does this outside information mean to you? A lot of what it seems to boil down to speaks to the state-society relations and their changing dynamics. People are. Most of their income, most of their livelihood comes through market activities. They now are making horizontal connections with others. They're communicating even internally with sanctioned cell phones about things that are probably pushing the line of what they're supposed to be communicating about. And they're receiving outside media, either entertainment or news. And when all that kind of gets put together, what it boils down to, and in fact, when you ask them if you could have anything, what would you like in terms of what they need to be more prosperous? It's space outside of the influence of the state. Very few of them that we've talked to articulate things beyond that, but basically now, especially young folks and North Koreans in general, want to be left alone from their government, which has kind of been over them for so long, that's what all of this seems to kind of boil down to. And so as we kind of look back at the last 10 years, at least on the outside information and media front, while we don't see this kind of mass, if X number of North Koreans know that South Korea is prosperous, then the whole place will come down. Obviously haven't seen that, but the trajectory seems to be clear and it's moving in a direction of openness. So. And now you.
Please stay on stage.
Sorry to keep that down.
Thank you, Roberta and Nat, for those great presentations. I'm interested in hearing why it is that it's a little bit more difficult getting the data collected. But before we move into question and answer, we'll hear from Greg, who will discuss the next decade. I also wanted to note that in the coming weeks, Greg will, with KEI and HRNK, publish a report that we'll email to all of you as well as have on our websites. So, Greg?
Well, thank you, Linda. My mission is certainly easy. All the points that were to be made have already been made. I think that any thoughts about the future should be, of course, based on an evaluation of what has happened for the past decade, and all other panelists have done a superb job conducting that evaluation today. Basically, an evaluation of a piece of legislation would have three fundamental components: an evaluation of the legislation itself, an evaluation of the government's capacity to implement the legislation, and an evaluation of the implementation effectiveness. I think that there is no doubt that this is an excellent piece of legislation. And the three strategic objectives, fundamental strategic objectives that Ambassador King mentioned earlier, improving human rights in North Korea through an increased information flow into that country, or through increased awareness of the North Korean human rights situation being one of them, increasing transparency being a second one, providing protection to North Korean escapees outside North Korea being the third of them. All of these objectives are as current today as they were 10 years ago. And certainly the U.S. government has the capacity to implement this legislation. I think that some comments could be made pertaining to the implementation effectiveness of the North Korea Human Rights Act. I think that one very important role that the Act has performed, and maybe hasn't been mentioned today, is support for human rights NGOs. In particular, support for human rights NGOs in South Korea and radio stations in South Korea, many of them staffed with former North Koreans broadcasting to North Korea. U.S. funding has been a true lifeline to these organizations. For reasons that we know, it is, well, the life of a human rights NGO dealing with North Korea is never easy, but it is even more difficult in South Korea, I would say, for three fundamental reasons. First, I think that our tradition of individual giving here in the United States is a little bit different. In South Korea, it's more focused on scholarships, on education, rather than this kind of mission. Secondly, of course, we're not here to discuss the South Korean North Korea Human Rights Act, but as we all know, this not being passed and what could translate into precious government support is not happening in South Korea. Thirdly, during a period of about 10 years in South Korea's history, organizations dealing with causes that were perceived as being closer to one side of the political spectrum were somehow penalized for their support of this type of organization. And, if you come from the corporate sector, you've dealt with a headache at some stage, you don't want to be experiencing the same issue again. So for these reasons, funding is not readily available to these organizations, and U.S. funding has played a truly important role. That said, I think it is very important to keep in mind that we need to find ways to broaden the donor base. The United States has played a very important role. We are fully aware of the very positive role that the European Union has played, for example, in being a co-sponsor of UN Human Rights Council resolutions, even the resolution establishing the UN Commission of Inquiry, or General Assembly resolutions addressing North Korean human rights. Nevertheless, our friends and allies, the European Union in particular, maybe could do more to provide support to organizations addressing North Korean human rights. I think that what we have also found out based on our experience for the past 10 years is that initially a significant amount of money by NGO standards was dispersed fairly quickly. We witnessed a proliferation of small NGOs, in particular in South Korea, that didn't necessarily have the absorption capacity needed to receive this type of funding. Maybe they didn't have the full fiscal responsibility that was needed to absorb this kind of funding at the time, and we somehow saw the pendulum swing in the opposite direction. I think we need to restore a sense of balance on that front. Now, here in the United States, of course, if we know one thing, is that we have been extraordinarily fortunate to have had Ambassador King in this position for the past 5 years. He has been an extraordinary advocate, supporter of the North Korean human rights cause, a true leader. We also know that the legislative branch has been the most active branch of the U.S. government in addressing North Korean human rights. What we also know is that appropriations are important. And what is also important is to remember that a dedicated source of funding for North Korea programs is needed in this appropriations. Now, of course, we do know that it is the administration's responsibility to make a request and up to the hill to make the appropriations. But sometimes as we are dealing with what some see as the utter collapse of the world order, from ISIS to Ukraine to Ebola, civil war and terrorism in West Africa, it is certainly difficult to think of North Korea all the time. So sometimes maybe because the administration is so busy, it is not motivated enough to keep North Korea high on the radar screen. It would be very important to have somebody, well, of course, apart from Ambassador Hill, Ambassador apologies, Ambassador King, it would be extraordinarily important to have somebody in the administration, have somebody in Congress, really taking on this cause and spearheading this cause. It is very important if a directive to the administration supporting North Korea programs is issued by Congress. A directive, for example, further supporting the flow of information to North Korea, and this could be truly beneficial. Of course, we are all very enthusiastic to see the momentum created by the UN Commission of Inquiry report. Those of us who are more pessimistic might say that the big surge regarding North Korean human rights has actually passed. And a question that I have heard at times is, where are the Sam Brownbacks of today? Now, certainly we know that there are members of Congress who are very dedicated to the North Korean human rights cause. The name of Congressman Smith has been mentioned today, Congressman Royce, and others. But certainly we do need those very symbolic and fully dedicated figures in Congress as well. As Ambassador King mentioned earlier today, we have the higher ground, and certainly the North Korean regime is losing the battle, losing ground. We have critical momentum, but this is not a sweeping victory. What happens if the nuclear issue comes back? Will we be able to maintain the same kind of momentum? We all remember the September the 23rd side meeting hosted by Secretary Kerry in New York on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly session, an extraordinary event for the first time ever, an event where not only the Secretary of State but the foreign ministers of Japan and South Korea spoke very strongly on North Korean human rights, followed by President Park Geun-hye before the General Assembly, who for the first time explicitly, directly, and very strongly mentioned North Korean human rights. At the same time, while taking into account all of these extraordinarily positive developments, it is important to remember another question. What UNCOI recommendations have been implemented so far? And certainly efforts are underway to ensure that a strong General Assembly resolution will factor in those recommendations. It is also very important to remember that this is not only the mission of the US government. Civil society also needs to be very active on this issue. There are organizations fully dedicated to North Korean human rights. LINK, for example, Liberty in North Korea comes to mind. But these organizations dedicated fully to North Korean human rights do not have the grassroots capacity or base of the Amnesty Internationals and Human Rights Watches of the world. We really need them to get involved in a more significant way in this campaign, with the ultimate goal of mounting a campaign on a par with the campaign that brought down apartheid in the 1980s. I am by no means comparing North Korea today to South Africa then. All I'm saying is that we need a campaign on a par with that effort. One of the points that have been made by our organization as well, as Roberta knows very well, she's one of the proponents, she has been one of the proponents of this approach since before the days of the UNCOI, the rights upfront approach. There are UN agencies on the ground involved in North Korea. Many of these agencies are significant recipients of US assistance. Whether it's UNICEF, whether it's FAO, whether it's the UNDP, whether it's the World Health Organization, they must be cognizant of the findings and recommendations of the UN Commission of Inquiry, and they must certainly apply the findings and recommendations of the UN Commission of Inquiry to their work in country in North Korea. For example, the World Health Organization has a Health in Prisons program. The guide can actually be downloaded online. Roberta's paper, published by 38 North, I'm not sure if Jenny Town is still here, she would have liked that, so the paper was mentioned by Ambassador King and Mr. Anderson earlier. Roberta makes a set of recommendations in that paper, and one of them is that the human rights issues on the agenda must certainly include the issues that North Korea states it has made progress on, but also the hard issues. For example, one point of entry. As mentioned earlier, North Korea has recently admitted through an official spokesperson, not to the existence of the Gulag, of the political prison camps, but to the existence of the Kyohaso, the labor training camps, or the mobile labor brigades, the Nodong Talyonde. So, as Roberta mentions in her paper, this could be the entry point for a conversation on access, ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross access, questions about the conditions, the working conditions, the pay. Are these workers being paid? Are they not being paid? If they're being paid, by the way, do you have a minimum wage? What is that minimum wage? So this is an opportunity, but certainly also, as Roberta cautions in her paper, holding any type of dialogue should not be a point of barter. Dialogue must be viewed as a legitimate part of diplomatic discourse and not a vehicle to trade away other human rights goals. Another very important recommendation that Roberta reminds us that the COI made was the creation of a human rights contact group. And the question that I would like to address to our colleagues in South Korea, if regional security and economic as well as human rights and humanitarian issues could be discussed under the auspices of such a human rights contact group, could this be part of the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative proposed by President Park Geun-hye of South Korea? Since the time is short, I think that when it comes to implementation, a discussion of the implementation effectiveness of the North Korea Human Rights Act, probably the most easily accessible, the most convenient, the most expedient implementation effectiveness monitoring mechanism is counting refugees. And the count certainly doesn't look great, 171 for the past 10 years. Ambassador King has mentioned many of the real and legitimate reasons why so few Koreans come here to the United States. Roberta Cohen has mentioned some of the reasons why some of these refugees may choose to come to the United States versus South Korea, for example. With the great help of my colleague Chin He and NKUSA, in order to prepare for writing this paper that Linda mentioned a few minutes ago, we have actually conducted a quick survey of North Koreans here in the United States, North Korean escapees in the United States, because after all, we should ask them first about their views on the North Korea Human Rights Act, on the implementation of the Act, on related issues. Sometimes these are disarmingly simple questions. What did they know about the United States? How did they know it? When did they decide to cross the border? How did their views on the United States change? When did these views change? Why do they think that there are so few North Korean escapees here in the United States? How significant has the North Korea Human Rights Act been for them? Are they aware of the existence of the Act? And if so, when did they become aware of the existence of the Act? And of course, while assistance is extraordinarily important, the South Korean government has made great investments and great efforts to assist in the resettlement of former North Koreans in South Korea, as mentioned earlier. Chin He's presentation, the title of her presentation was about former North Koreans and achieving the American dream, in search of the American dream. I think that we also need to remember that the American dream is not about being assisted. It's not about assumptions that former North Koreans necessarily need assistance. It's about enabling them to fulfill their American dream. And basically, again, we have to ask questions, the type of skills that are needed, as Chin He mentioned earlier. Sometimes these are disarmingly simple issues and questions. One has to ask them about the times when they needed help, whether they had it, whether they didn't have it. It's also useful, I would say, to determine to what degree former North Koreans here are reliant on Korean-speaking, oftentimes faith-based communities. This is tremendous help, and this is great help. But to what extent does this help actually limit their access to broader opportunities here in the United States. And since I am out of time, I have to say that my greatest wish to all of us today is that our 20th anniversary, no, our 15th anniversary is exclusively celebratory and doesn't include any thoughts on the future of the Act. We hope that anything related to the Act will have been in the past by that time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. For the interest of time, I'm going to open up questions from the floor. Also, for those who are watching the live stream, please feel free to tweet to @KoreaEconInst. I see that Adam Cathcart in London is viewing the program, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait until a microphone is passed to you. Right up here in the front.
I can use my bus.
There we go. There's a microphone.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm usually an intelligence analyst and occasional international affairs professor. There are a couple of firms in the U.S. who are pursuing very interesting technology, which is to emplace very high altitude, i.e. actually above missiles, drones and or simple mylar balloons, so that places like the middle of the Congo could actually receive the internet and even television or radio broadcasts. They have not done so in the context of North Korea. But I wonder if perhaps we might engage in, perhaps a sub rosa endeavor to emplace these things, encourage these firms, Google is one of them, over North Korea. The lifespan of these things, in the case of the drone, might be a month. You might have to put up one every month. The mylar balloons might have to put up one every couple of days, but they're cheap. I think that would break open our possibility of accessing the Korean population through both broadcast and increasingly through internet. Can I ask you about what you feel about that evolution?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, right now, the research we do, internet, as you know, is limited to almost no one, literally a handful of people. Trends that would suggest that internet, such as you kind of described, might have a chance of having an immediate impact are things like laptop computers, which are now more prevalent than they once were. And certainly there are lots of restrictions on those. They have to be registered when they're purchased. And still most of the computers that we find people use are in shared spaces. The laptops are still more rare than the school computer that you could use to maybe after hours swap dramas on or something. But there's no real barrier if that technology was in place to those who do have access to laptops, I suppose, taking advantage of it.
Question right in the back.
Not to take exception to your comments about a handful of people, I just want to caution not to be too cavalier about assuming the internet is not accessible to a great number. I mean, it's certainly hundreds, probably thousands of mid-level bureaucrats have easy access to the internet. And in fact, I've had access to the internet in guest rooms in North Korea, although it is through a dial-up modem. And I didn't have one in my computer, and my son said, "Dad, if I thought you were going to never use a dial-up modem, I would have put one in there, but God knows." So it may be a lower-level technology, but it's certainly accessible.
I mean, most of the, and actually in more recent studies, we have picked up, a person or two who has used the internet in North Korea and claims to, but generally what we can tease out of that is it's under very monitored circumstances. So as you describe it, there is a level of bureaucrats who might have access to it, but their use would be very monitored.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have a question up in the front.
I'm Pastor Hee-moon Lee, the Vice Chair of North Korea Freedom Coalition and also President of a global network for the human rights and freedom of North Korean people. I'm really appreciate the United States government has been done last 10 years in terms of North Korean matter and human rights issue. And very often when we have a top level meeting with the State Department and National Security Council and with the President or with Mr. Sam Brownback, we even made a little joke, but it is not a joke, but it may be a truth. When I heard Robert Cohen's analysis about those numbers, especially, we are focusing on the number very significantly because it is very important. And we made a joke one time. Do you know what is the best clue to deal with North Korean matter? Just accept 5,000 North Korean refugees or 10,000 North Korean refugees, then there will be, just a big disaster in North Korea. So out of 70,000 refugees and accepting 17, it is not, we cannot understand. Compared to the refugee acceptance in England and Germany, Netherlands and Canada and all other countries, they are facing same kind of issue. Terrorism is the same kind of issue. But compared to the passion and the law has been enacted again, United States government, should accept more than 17 North Korean refugees. You spend a very, very long time, energy, money, and everything, but did not solve any problem on nuclear issue. They have. So maybe this is the time in targeting next 10 years. And there are many experts, and there are more cooperative attitude. The last 10 regime, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, and NGO activists, and my family has been problematic in South Korea. But the last two presidents has been really helpful. So if you really have a really passion, bring out more North Korean refugees in China and Southeast Asia, and that can solve, unimaginable problem. So I would strongly suggest State Department and the people who are studying about this issue and how we can accept more North Korean refugees from China and other countries. And if money involved, then there is a way. And if there is a theory, then there is a way. So I'd like to raise this issue. Thank you.
I just wanted to make one response. I appreciated your comments very much. I would hope that the Korean American community in this country would become much more mobilized around the North Korea issue. That would encompass both human rights issues in North Korea and inclusive of the refugee issue. I have been struck by the, even at times a lack of interest or fear, or I'm not sure, I couldn't explain it, about why there isn't that kind of mobilization that you do find for other human rights causes over the decades from communities in this country. And I think that could make a real difference when you look at U.S. policy in a number of areas.
One more question.
Yes, John Fox, former State Department, former World Bank, former Open Society Institute, lots of formers, but involved for several years in most of the aims of the Act, one way or another, especially the information flow. I'd like to especially on Greg's points about excellent recommendations, I thought. After the fine report that Nat authored, supported by the State Department on a quiet opening and on all the opportunity, including for non-governmental media to North Korea, there was actually a quiet closing of U.S. support to those very organizations. And I think the history of free information flow to and within closed societies around the world demonstrates that it's the indigenous and surrogate indigenous media and actors who are essential to any real change, to sustainable change, to peaceful transitions. They have the contacts, they have the flow, and I think one of the things that's being sacrificed by the U.S. turning away from that support and support to the very human rights groups that Greg referenced over the last couple of years is those groups have networks. They have organic networks that are very important, so that as this window or these windows increase into and out of the North, those networks become more important and they can be better leveraged by those organizations. That has been sacrificed specifically by the State Department for reasons that are really not all that clear, I think, to a number of us. Why turn the back of the U.S. on these groups just as they are maturing and have shown remarkable results, including results competitive with the international broadcasters on an hour-by-hour basis, prorated, quite competitive. So I just want to put that for the record. I would like to highlight in one other way Roberta Cohen's excellent presentation and on the numbers. The United Kingdom, over this same period of time we're talking about, without a significant Korean community, without a Human Rights Act for North Korea, and without subsidy packages, has let in 6 times as many North Korean refugees as the United States, and on a population-adjusted basis, 40 times as many. So I really think the U.S. response requires a lot more explanation, a lot better explanation than it's receiving, and a much higher priority. Is there something in the data, Nat, that North Koreans don't like the United States as well as the UK? I mean, I know there's some attitudinal figures. What do those show? Why would they not? They don't want to come here because of the propaganda residue? And I mean, is there anything in the actual data we have?
Generally haven't investigated that issue specifically in our studies. There are some attitudinal questions that we've asked over the years about like perceptions of the U.S. and perceptions of South Korea, and South Korea is always kind of much more favorably viewed. But perceptions of the U.S. have increased, and I mean that's something we were able to look at in relation to foreign media as well. That the more people know about the outside world, the more their perceptions of the U.S. have increased. So they're certainly much better than it once was. As you say, the residual effects of the propaganda probably play into that quite a bit in terms of folks being scared. But there's probably a population who feels much more favorably about the U.S. than perhaps they once would have.
I think we have time for one final question, if anyone has one. Okay. Well, before thanking the panel on their discussion, I just want to go over a couple of administrative items. We're going to take a short break before viewing The Exodus Out of North Korea, which is a Channel A South Korea production, also the Remy winner, to gather some food that's outside for lunch. Also, I wanted to let you know we'll be continuing the discussion on North Korea on Monday with the Hanmi Club. We'll be discussing unification and the U.S. ROK alliance. And also, in response to Peter, I know this is some on the flip side, but we'll also have a program on Wednesday on North Korea drones with Van Jackson. So thank you. If you could just join me in thanking the panel and the discussion.